5 rejected brides knocked on his door and changed the mountain man's life forever. It was the dead of winter. Snow pounded the Rockies, the kind of night no soul should be out. Yet 5 young women, dressed in torn wedding gowns, stood shivering at a lonely cabin door, cast aside at the altar, their flowers frozen in their hands. Inside waited a man who had sworn off the world, a widower with nothing but his fire and his rifle. He thought he was taking them in for a single night of shelter. But what walked into his home was more than heartbreak. It was a storm of secrets. Behind every torn veil lay a hidden truth: land deeds, treaty rights, blood feuds, and promises broken by powerful men. And the law itself would soon come riding, ready to drag them all back into chains of shame. 5 brides, 1 mountain man. A battle for dignity, justice, and love in a land that shows no mercy. When the law, the past, and the heart all collide, what will happen to the man who opened his door? And can 5 rejected brides truly change his life forever? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. Jackson McCord sat alone in his sturdy log cabin, listening to the howling wind shake the snow-laden pines outside. The blizzard had swept in fierce and sudden from the high peaks, bringing darkness early to the Colorado mountains. He added another log to the pot-bellied stove, watching orange sparks dance up the blackened pipe. The beans simmered in their iron pot, filling the one-room cabin with their humble aroma. Jackson had lived alone in these mountains for nigh on 5 years now. Since Sarah passed, the solitude suited him most days, though winter nights like this could stir up memories best left buried. He stirred the beans with a wooden spoon, then checked the coffee pot, keeping warm at the back of the stove. The familiar tasks helped quiet his mind as the storm raged outside. Wind whistled through the chinks in the logs despite his careful mudding last fall. The shutters rattled against their leather hinges. The grandfather clock in the corner, Sarah's pride and joy, struck midnight with solemn chimes. Jackson was just banking the fire for the night when sharp pounding at the door made him freeze. His hand moved automatically to the old Colt single-action army revolver at his hip. No one in their right mind would be out in weather like this. Raiders sometimes tried the high passes, even in winter, looking for isolated cabins to plunder. The pounding came again, more desperate this time, accompanied by what sounded like sobbing. Jackson drew his revolver, approaching the door cautiously. "Who's there?" he called out, voice rough from disuse. "Please," came a woman's cry, nearly lost in the wind. "Please help us." "Us?" Jackson's finger stayed near the trigger as he unbarred the door. The wind nearly tore it from his grasp as he opened it, letting in a swirl of snow, and he blinked in disbelief. 5 women in wedding dresses. They stumbled across his threshold in a flutter of torn white silk and wilted flowers, faces pale as milk above their muddy hems. The last one through nearly collapsed, caught by her companions. Jackson quickly shut and barred the door against the storm. "Lord have mercy," he muttered, holstering his revolver. The women huddled together near the stove, shivering violently in their ruined finery. Tears had frozen on their cheeks, and their lips were turning blue. "What in tarnation are you doing out in weather like this?" One of the women, tall and dark-haired, stepped forward. Her voice quavered but held dignity. "We had nowhere else to go, sir. We saw your chimney smoke from the pass." She swayed slightly. "Here now, sit down before you fall down." Jackson pulled his rough-hewn chairs closer to the stove. "All of you." He grabbed the blankets from his bed, draping them around trembling shoulders. "I've got hot coffee and beans. Not fancy fare, but it'll warm you up." The women sank into the chairs, clutching the blankets tight. Jackson ladled beans into his few tin bowls and poured coffee into matching cups, passing them around. The women's hands shook so badly he feared they'd spill. "Thank you, sir," murmured one of the younger ones, blonde hair falling in wet tangles around her face. "You're most kind." Jackson waved off the thanks, uncomfortable. "Can't leave folks to freeze. But I'd like to know what brought 5 ladies in wedding dresses to my door at midnight in a blizzard." The women exchanged glances. Fresh tears welled up in several pairs of eyes. The dark-haired one who'd spoken first drew a shuddering breath. "My name is Margaret Collins. We were all to be married today, in town." Her voice broke. Each of us, was left standing at the altar. Our grooms never came." Shocked murmurs escaped the other women. The blonde one buried her face in her hands, shoulders shaking. "Rebecca Thompson," whispered the smallest of the group, her dress adorned with now sodden lace. "Mine said he'd changed his mind, right there in front of everyone." Her voice was bitter. "Said he'd found someone prettier." "Clara Wilson." This from a sturdy woman with auburn hair. Mine was drunk. Laughed in my face when I begged him to reconsider. The blonde raised her tear-stained face. "Elizabeth Parker. He took my dowry money yesterday. Was gone on the morning stage." Fresh sobs racked her slight frame. The last woman, who had nearly fainted earlier, spoke so softly Jackson had to lean forward to hear. "Mary Stewart," he said. "Said he couldn't marry someone like me. My mother was Cherokee." She touched her high cheekbones, pain evident in her dark eyes. Jackson's jaw clenched at their stories. He'd seen plenty of meanness in his time, but this... The whole town just let this happen? Margaret's laugh held no humor. They laughed. "Called us foolish girls who couldn't keep our men. Said we deserved it. We couldn't stay there, facing that every day. We just started walking. Didn't know where else to go. The storm caught us on the pass," Clara added, sipping her coffee. "We thought we were done for until we saw your smoke." Jackson studied the 5 women, hearing what they weren't saying. No families to turn to. No other options. Providence had led them to his door, though he'd long since stopped believing in such things. What was he supposed to do with 5 heartbroken brides? "You're safe here for tonight," he said gruffly. "Storm's too bad to go anywhere else anyway." He added more wood to the stove. "I'll make up pallets by the fire. Get some rest. Morning's soon enough to figure out what comes next." Relief softened their faces. One by one, the women finished their simple meals. Jackson laid out his spare blankets and bedrolls on the plank floor, creating makeshift beds as close to the stove's warmth as he dared. The women huddled together, wedding dresses crumpled around them like fallen snow. Soon, their breathing deepened into exhausted sleep. Jackson settled into his chair, revolver close at hand. Something told him those 5 grooms might come looking for their runaway brides, and he meant to be ready if they did. He watched the flames dance behind the stove's clouded glass, listening to the storm's fury slowly fade. 5 rejected brides, sent to him by whatever twist of fate, or perhaps, a voice whispered in his mind, by something more deliberate than fate. He'd turned his back on God after Sarah died, but maybe the Almighty wasn't finished with him yet. The grandfather clock ticked steadily in its corner, marking time as the women slept. Jackson kept his vigil, wondering what morning would bring. Dawn crept across the snow-laden peaks, painting the world in shades of pearl and silver. Jackson McCord rose from his vigil, muscles stiff from the long night in his wooden chair. He moved, quietly, not wanting to wake his unexpected guests just yet. The 5 women lay huddled close to the stove, their wedding dresses wrinkled and mud-stained, looking far less grand in the harsh morning light. The familiar routine of morning chores steadied his hands. He stoked the fire first, adding fresh logs until warmth spread through the cabin once more. The coffee pot went on to boil, and soon the sharp scent of brewing coffee mingled with the sizzle of salt pork in his old cast-iron skillet. One by one, the women stirred. They sat up slowly, faces pinched with discomfort from sleeping on the hard floor. Shame colored their cheeks as they caught sight of their ruined gowns, tangible reminders of yesterday's humiliation. "Best eat while it's hot," Jackson said gruffly, setting out tin plates. "Coffee's ready too." They gathered around his rough-hewn table, perching awkwardly on chairs and stumps. The dark-haired woman, Sarah Whitcomb, she introduced herself properly, now spoke first. "We're deeply grateful for your hospitality, Mr. McCord." Her voice was soft but clear. "I fear we imposed terribly upon you last night." Jackson shook his head. No imposition in keeping folks from freezing. He passed around the coffee, strong and black. "Though I reckon there's more to your stories than panic and weather." The women exchanged glances. Sarah's fingers tightened around her cup. My intended discovered I cannot bear children," she whispered. "He announced it to the whole church, said he wouldn't waste his life on a barren woman." Tears gleamed in her eyes, but she held them back. Lydia Marsh, the auburn-haired woman with gentle curves, touched Sarah's arm. Mine said no man would want a wife as plump as me. Called me a desperate old maid, trying to trap him. Her chin lifted. I own my father's ranch deed outright, you see? That's what he really wanted. At least you weren't marked like me, said Willow Harper, the schoolteacher. She turned slightly, revealing a scar that ran from temple to jaw on one side of her face. Fire took my parents home when I was 16. I survived. But this. She gestured to her scarred flesh. My groom said he couldn't bear to look at me for the rest of his life, said I was unfit to be seen in proper society. Maria Tenaya sat straighter, pride evident in her bearing despite her torn dress. My father was Anglo, my mother Apache. The man who courted me knew this, claimed it didn't matter. Her dark eyes flashed. But at the church, he said he'd come to his senses, couldn't taint his family line with Indian blood. Young Ruth Miller, barely more than a girl, spoke last. Mine took my dowry money and ran. Her voice trembled. I worked 3 years at the seamstress shop to save it. When I couldn't pay him more, he chose the banker's daughter instead. Jackson's jaw clenched tight as he listened. Each story struck something raw inside him. Memories of how Sarah's own family had cut her off from marrying a rough mountain man like himself. They'd called her fallen, ruined. She'd never seen them again before the fever took her. What do you aim to do now? He asked, keeping his voice neutral. We can't go back, Willow said quietly. The whole town saw. They all laughed. Could we? Sarah hesitated. Could we perhaps stay here, just until the storm passes? We'd work to earn our keep. Jackson studied them thoughtfully. 5 women alone in his cabin would set tongues wagging worse than they already were, but he couldn't turn them out, not with snow still falling and wolves in the hills. Reckon you can stay a spell, he said finally. But I mean what I said about working. This ain't no charity house. Relief brightened their faces. They set to proving themselves useful right away. Sarah and Lydia took to sweeping the plank floors, while Maria and Ruth gathered his mending pile. Willow offered to help him butcher the venison he'd brought down 2 days prior. The afternoon passed in industry. Jackson found himself watching their quiet efficiency with something like approval. Sarah organized his scattered supplies with a bookkeeper's precision. Lydia's strong hands made quick work of kneading bread dough. Maria showed a deft touch with needle and thread, while Ruth's fine stitching would put a town seamstress to shame. And Willow, there was something about her careful movements that drew his eye, though he tried not to notice. By evening, savory venison stew bubbled in his biggest pot, filling the cabin with rich aromas. Fresh bread cooled on the shelf, and his work shirts had never been so neatly mended. The women had even found time to wash their faces and smooth their hair, though their wedding dresses remained sorry affairs. For the first time in years, conversation and warmth filled his home. Jackson felt something crack in his chest, like spring ice breaking up on the river. He'd grown too used to silence, maybe, too used to being alone with his grief. They were just finishing supper when the sound cut through the gathering dusk, sleigh bells jingling, accompanied by the steady thud of hoofbeats approaching the cabin. The women froze, faces draining of color. Jackson rose slowly from his chair, hand dropping to his revolver. Trouble, he reckoned, had just come calling. The heavy knock rattled the cabin door on its leather hinges, making the women jump. Sarah's spoon clattered against her bowl. Willow's hand found Maria's arm, squeezing tight. Jackson rose slowly, every muscle tense as a drawn bowstring. Stay behind me, he murmured, moving toward the door. The brides huddled together near the back wall, their faces pale in the lamplight. Another knock thundered through the cabin, harder this time. Open up, McCord. Sheriff's business. Jackson recognized that voice, Elias Riggins, the county sheriff. His jaw tightened as he unlatched the door, letting in a gust of snow-laden wind and 3 uniformed men. Sheriff Riggins stepped. In first, snow crusting his heavy wool coat. 2 deputies flanked him, their hands hovering near their gun belts. Evening, Sheriff. Jackson's voice was calm, though his fingers itched to rest on his holstered revolver. Mighty cold night for a social call. Riggins brushed snow from his hat, dark eyes scanning the cabin's interior. His gaze settled on the 5 women, and his thin lips curved in what might have been a smile. Seems you've been entertaining guests, McCord. These ladies were reported missing from town earlier today. Missing? Jackson's eyebrows rose. Interesting choice of words for women who walked here on their own 2 feet. Their intended husbands are mighty concerned. Riggins reached into his coat, pulling out a sheaf of papers. Got signed documents here asserting their rights. These women entered into marriage contracts, you see. Legal binding ones. Contracts? Willow's voice shook with anger. They humiliated us at the altar, called us worthless, damaged. Now, miss. Riggins cut in smoothly. What transpired at the church is a private matter between you and your betrothed. But the law's the law. These gentlemen have rights. Rights? Jackson's quiet word cracked like a whip. What rights do men have who break sacred vows before they're even made? Who mock and shame innocent women for sport? The sheriff's face hardened. You're harboring them against their lawful engagements, McCord. That's interference with contracts, maybe even kidnapping. You want that kind of trouble? They came here freely, Jackson said, his hand now resting openly on his holstered revolver. And they'll stay freely until they choose otherwise. He looked at each woman in turn. Tell him yourselves, ladies. Are you here against your will? Sarah stepped forward first, chin high despite her trembling. I came here of my own choice, Sheriff. I claim sanctuary under Mr. McCord's roof. As do I, Lydia declared, her voice stronger. And I, Maria added, dark, eyes flashing. Ruth and Willow echoed the others, their voices joining in solidarity. The sheriff's face darkened with each declaration. You're making a mistake, McCord, Riggins growled. Those grooms have influence in town. The railroad's backing them. You really want to stand against that kind of power? Jackson moved closer to the sheriff, his voice dropping low. I reckon you remember my Sarah, Elias. Remember how her family cast her out for marrying beneath her station? Remember how you stood by, letting them drive her to tears in the street? Riggins shifted uncomfortably. That was different. No, Jackson cut in. It wasn't. And I won't stand by watching good women broken by men's pride again. He straightened to his full height. These ladies are under my protection. They'll stay until they decide different. The law says nothing about forcing unwilling brides to marry, Jackson interrupted. You know that as well as I do. Now, unless you've got proper warrants, which we both know you don't, I suggest you ride on home before this storm gets worse. The sheriff's hand twitched toward his gun, but Jackson's steady gaze and ready stance made him think better of it. The deputies exchanged nervous glances. This isn't over, McCord, Riggins spat. You're choosing the wrong side here. There'll be consequences. There always are, Jackson replied evenly. Good night, Sheriff. He stood in the doorway until the lawmen mounted up, their sleigh bells fading into the snowy night. Only then did he close and bar the door, his shoulders sagging slightly as he turned back to the room. The women burst into tears, not of fear this time, but relief. Sarah pressed her hands to her face, shoulders shaking. Lydia wrapped an arm around Ruth, who sobbed quietly. Maria murmured what sounded like a prayer in Apache, while Willow simply stared at Jackson with wondering eyes. Thank you, she whispered. We've no right to bring such trouble to your door, but thank you. Jackson shook his head, moving to stoke the fire. Don't thank me yet. Sheriff's right about one thing, this is just beginning. Those grooms won't take kindly to being refused. They'll try other ways to force you back. What can we do? Ruth asked, wiping her eyes. For tonight? Get some rest. Tomorrow we'll figure out how to make this cabin more defensible. He checked the window shutters, making sure they were secure. And I reckon it's time I taught you ladies how to shoot. As he moved about the cabin, securing it for the night, Jackson sent up a silent prayer. Not for himself, he'd faced worse odds before, but for strength to protect these 5 brave souls who'd trusted him with their safety, for wisdom to guide them through whatever trials lay ahead. The fire crackled low, casting long shadows on the walls. Outside, the wind howled through the pines like a hungry wolf. Jackson settled into his chair near the door, his revolver close at hand. It would be another long night of watching, but he didn't mind. Some things were worth losing sleep over. The brides arranged themselves near the stove again, sharing blankets and whispered comfort. One by one, they drifted off to sleep, leaving Jackson alone with his thoughts and the dying fire. He touched the empty space where his wedding ring used to rest, remembering Sarah's courage in the face of her family's rejection. She would have understood his choice tonight. Maybe she'd even had a hand in bringing these women to his door, working through the mysterious ways of Providence. The thought brought a slight smile to his weathered face as he settled in to wait out the night. Morning brought a break in the storm. The heavy clouds lifted, revealing pristine snow draped across the mountainside like a fresh-washed sheet. Jackson stood on his cabin's porch, watching the sun pierce through bare aspen branches. The air felt crisp and clean, though his bones told him more snow would come before long. Inside, the women were finishing the last of the morning's cornmeal mush. Their wedding dresses, now wrinkled and stained, made poor work clothes. Jackson rummaged through his trunk, pulling out spare shirts and trousers. "Ain't exactly fitting for ladies," he said, setting the clothes on the table. "But they'll serve better than those gowns for what needs doing today." The women exchanged glances, then Sarah spoke up. "What needs doing, Mr. McCord?" "Wood needs hauling. Creek's half frozen, but we still need water. Cabin won't keep itself." He pulled on his heavy coat. "Storms broke for now. Time you learned how things work up here." They changed while he waited outside, emerging in his oversized clothes with skirts bundled underneath. Despite their circumstances, Ruth couldn't help giggling at how they looked. Soon they were all smiling, even Maria, who'd been the quietest among them. Jackson led them to the woodpile first. He demonstrated how to properly stack the logs, explaining, "Wood's life up here. Let it get low. You might as well dig your own grave." He showed them how to check for rot and arrange the pieces so air could flow between them. The women struggled at first. The logs were heavy, the snow deep. But they formed a line, passing wood from person to person. Lydia, the strongest, took the heaviest pieces. Maria organized the stacking with careful precision. Soon they found their rhythm. "Reminds me of barn raising back home," Sarah said, brushing snow from her borrowed pants. Everyone working together, making something good happen. The work was hard, but laughter began to bubble up. When Ruth slipped and sat down hard in a snowdrift, when Lydia's hat blew off and landed in a tree. When Maria discovered she could carry 3 small logs at once. It was tentative at first, like spring ice breaking, but genuine. Jackson realized he hadn't heard such sounds in his cabin for years. Near midday, Willow approached him as he split another round of wood. She waited until his axe was lowered before speaking. "Mr. McCord?" Her voice was soft but steady. Would you show me how to set a snare? For rabbits, I mean. I'd like to help with more than just housework." Jackson studied her face, marked by the old burn scar but beautiful in its quiet determination. "Ain't easy work," he warned. "Takes patience." "I have patience," she replied with a small smile. "Teaching school children saw to that." He nodded, setting aside his axe. From his coat pocket, he pulled a length of wire. "Watch close now. This here's the way my father showed me, and his father before him." Willow paid careful attention as Jackson demonstrated how to bend the wire, where to place the loop, how to secure it properly. Her fingers were cold but deft as she practiced the knots. When she successfully set her first snare, her face lit up with pride. "Well done," Jackson said softly. Something in his chest tightened at her smile. They worked through the afternoon. Jackson showed them how to break ice at the creek's edge, how to carry water without spilling most of it, how to bank coals to keep the fire through the night. The women absorbed it all, determined to learn. By sunset, the cabin was transformed. Fresh split wood stood stacked high against the wall. Clean water filled the barrels. The floor had been swept, the windows wiped clear of frost. Maria and Ruth had even managed to catch 2 rabbits in their newly set snares. Lydia took charge of supper, kneading cornbread dough while Sarah and Maria prepared the rabbits. The cabin filled with warm, homey smells. Jackson found himself watching Willow as she set the table, humming softly to herself. After the meal, they lingered around the table, reluctant to end this peaceful moment. Then Willow began to sing, her voice clear and sweet in the lamplight. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. One by one, the others joined in. Sarah's alto, Maria's gentle soprano, Ruth and Lydia finding their parts. The harmony wasn't perfect, but it filled the cabin with something precious. Jackson's hands gripped his chair hard. That hymn, his Sarah had loved it so, had sung it while cooking, while mending, while rocking their stillborn babe. He hadn't heard it since her passing. Willow's eyes met his across the table. There was understanding there, and compassion. She'd chosen the hymn deliberately, he realized, not to wound, but to heal. They sang several more hymns before evening prayers. Jackson listened, something long frozen in his heart beginning to thaw. His cabin didn't feel hollow anymore. It felt like home again. But as the women prepared for bed, Jackson's unease returned. During his last check of the premises, he'd spotted tracks in the snow, boot prints that hadn't been there earlier. Someone had been watching the cabin. He loaded his rifle carefully, checking the action. The familiar weight of it was comforting as he set it by the door. In his mind, he mapped out defensible positions, escape routes, places where someone might try to force entry. The women's soft breathing filled the cabin as they settled into sleep. Jackson added another log to the fire, watching shadows dance across the walls. He'd grown used to being alone, to having only himself to worry about. Now he had 5 lives depending on him. Checking his revolver one last time, he placed it within easy reach before lying down. Tomorrow he'd need to teach them about guns, too. The thought of those delicate hands handling weapons bothered him, but not as much as the thought of leaving them defenseless. A log popped in the fire. Outside, an owl called once, then fell silent. Jackson closed his eyes but kept his senses alert. Whatever trouble was coming, it would find him ready. Dawn painted the sky in streaks of pale rose when Jackson stepped onto his front porch. Fresh snow had fallen overnight, a light dusting that revealed every track and trail. His practiced eye followed the marks around his homestead, jaw tightening at what he found. Hoofprints circled the cabin, not just passing by, but deliberately tracking a perimeter. Someone had been watching, studying their habits, looking for weaknesses. Jackson counted at least 3 different horses from the variations in the prints. Inside, the women were stirring. He heard the soft clink of the coffee pot, smelled biscuits beginning to warm. Before joining them, he made one more circuit of the cabin, noting places where shadows ran deep enough to hide a man. "Ladies," he announced as he stepped inside, stamping snow from his boots. "Need to set some rules today. No one goes beyond sight of the cabin alone. Keep to the open spaces where I can see you clear." Sarah paused in her cooking. "You found something out there?" "Tracks." Jackson accepted a tin cup of coffee from Willow with a nod of thanks. 3 riders, at least. Been watching the place. Maria's dark eyes narrowed. "The sheriff's men? Could be. Could be your former grooms. Either way, we stay alert." Despite the warning, they needed water, and fish would make a welcome change from salted pork. After breakfast, Jackson led them down to the stream, everyone bundled against the cold. The water ran swift beneath a crust of ice, dark and dangerous. "Mind your footing," he cautioned, demonstrating how to test the ice before stepping. "Currents strong enough to sweep you under if you break through." They worked together, cutting blocks of ice with Jackson's saw, forming a chain to pass the heavy chunks up the bank. The work was hard but warming. Soon coats were loosened, cheeks flushed with effort. "Now for the interesting part," Jackson said, once they had enough ice. He pulled simple fishing gear from his coat, line, hooks, and a few strips of dried meat for bait. Streams full of trout, even in winter. Just got to know where to look. Maria stepped forward, eyes bright with recognition. "My father showed me this kind of fishing," she said. "The Apache way, through the ice." Jackson handed her a line. "Oh, show us what you remember." Maria moved with quiet confidence, selecting a spot where the current slowed near a fallen log. Her movements were precise as she baited the hook and lowered it through their cut hole. The others watched, fascinated, as she demonstrated the subtle wrist motion needed to entice the fish. "Like this," she explained, voice warm with memory. "The movement must look natural, like a struggling insect. My father said fish are not foolish. They know when something moves wrong." Within minutes, she had landed their first trout. The silverfish flopped on the snow, scales glinting in the winter Sunday. The other women cheered, then eagerly set up their own lines under Maria's guidance. Jackson watched them work, noting how they supported each other. Ruth helped Lydia when her line tangled. Sarah and Willow figured out how to work together, one holding the line while the other cleared ice from the hole. They were becoming a team, these 5 scattered souls. The sun was dropping toward the mountains when they finally headed back, carrying a good string of trout. The fish would make a fine supper, along with the last of the cornbread. Jackson felt a surge of pride in their accomplishment, not just the catch, but how they had worked together to achieve it. They were almost to the cabin when the shot rang out. The sharp crack echoed off the mountains. Splinters flew from the woodpile where the bullet struck. Jackson reacted instantly, shoving the nearest women toward the cabin door. "Inside! Now!" They scrambled for safety, fish forgotten in the snow. Jackson pressed himself against the cabin wall, scanning the tree line. There, a flash of movement, a horse and rider disappearing into the shadows. He caught just a glimpse, not enough to identify the shooter. When he entered the cabin, the women huddled together near the fireplace. Their faces were pale but determined. None had screamed or panicked, he noted with approval. "Was it them?" Ruth asked, voice barely above a whisper. "The men who left us, likely?" Jackson checked that all shutters were secure. Or someone working with them. Shot was meant to frighten, not harm. Else they'd have aimed at us, not the woodpile. "They want us back," Lydia's hands twisted in her skirt. "To finish what they started. To shame us again." "No," Jackson's voice was firm. "That won't happen. You're under my protection now, and I aim to keep you safe." Maria stood straight, chin lifted. "We can help protect ourselves. Teach us to shoot, Mr. McCord. My father taught me some, before he died. The others can learn." Jackson considered this. He had been thinking the same, though the idea of these gentle women handling weapons still troubled him. But Maria was right. They needed every advantage. "Tomorrow," he promised. "For now, we secure the cabin for the night." They worked together, barring doors and windows. Jackson showed them how to brace furniture against entry points, where to store buckets of water in case of fire, which floorboards could serve as hiding places if needed. The forgotten fish were retrieved and cooked, though appetite was scarce now. They ate quietly, each lost in thought. Outside, wind moaned through the pines, another storm approaching. When supper was done, Sarah suggested they pray together. They joined hands in a circle, heads bowed. Jackson felt Willow's small hand trembling in his as Sarah's clear voice rose. "Lord, protect us in our hour of need. Give us strength to face what comes. Guide those who wish us harm to see the error of their ways." The prayer continued, but Jackson found himself studying the women's faces in the firelight. These were not the same frightened creatures who had appeared at his door that stormy night. Hardship was forging them into something stronger, like iron in the blacksmith's fire. He had sworn to protect them, and he would. But watching them now, Maria's quiet strength, Willow's gentle determination, Sarah's deep faith, Ruth's quick mind, Lydia's steady heart, he knew they would also protect each other. And perhaps, in their own way, they were protecting him too, filling his empty home with purpose and life again. The storm broke over the mountains as they prepared for sleep. Wind rattled the shutters, carrying the first heavy flakes of snow. Jackson checked his weapons one last time, then settled into his chair by the door. The women found their places, huddled close for warmth and comfort. Sleep came slowly to the cabin. Jackson kept his vigil, listening to the storm's fury mix with soft breathing and the crack of burning logs. His mind worked through plans and possibilities, weighing options against risks. The enemy was out there, watching and waiting. But in here, something precious was growing. A family forged in adversity, bound by choice rather than blood. He would not let harm come to it. The storm howled like a living thing, piling snow against the cabin walls. Inside, Jackson stood at the window, watching white curtains of snow obscure the world beyond. They were well and truly trapped now. 3 days, he muttered, turning back to the warmth of the fire. "Maybe 4 before we can dig out." Sarah looked up from where she was taking inventory of their supplies. "The flour's running low," she reported. "And we're down to our last slab of salt pork." Jackson nodded grimly. "We'll need to ration careful. Cut the portions small. Make everything stretch." "We've known lean times before," Lydia said softly. "We'll manage." The women had spread their ruined wedding dresses across the floor, assessing the damage from their flight through the woods. Torn lace, muddy satin, and ripped muslin told the story of their desperate journey. Willow ran her scarred fingers over a length of cream-colored fabric, her expression thoughtful. Such fine material, she mused. Seems a shame to let it go to waste. Maria picked up a handful of lace. Mr. McCord's coat is wearing thin at the elbows. I've noticed him shivering when he checks the horses. The women exchanged meaningful looks. Willow sat straighter, her quiet voice carrying new purpose. Ladies, I believe I have an idea. While Jackson chopped more firewood in the storage room, the brides gathered their dresses and sewing supplies. Willow, who had learned fine needlework before her accident, directed their efforts. They worked in whispers, measuring and cutting. Layer the satin between muslin for warmth, she instructed. The lace can reinforce stress points at shoulders and elbows. Their nimble fingers worked through the afternoon. The wedding dresses, symbols of rejection, transformed piece by piece into something new. Each woman contributed what remained of her gown: Sarah's pearl buttons, Ruth's silk lining, Lydia's sturdy muslin, Maria's intricate lacework, and the smooth satin from Willow's dress. The work helped distract them from hunger, as Jackson carefully portioned their dwindling supplies: a handful of beans each, a small piece of trout, a carefully measured cup of coffee. No one complained. They had all faced worse. On the third day, as the storm began to lose its fury, they finished their secret project. The coat they had created was a masterpiece of practical beauty. Layers of fabric providing warmth, reinforced seams ensuring durability. Though made from wedding finery, it looked properly masculine, the careful stitching giving it dignity despite its unusual origins. That evening, as Jackson returned from checking the horses, the women gathered around him. Willow stepped forward, holding their gift. Mr. McCord, she said, her voice soft but steady. We wanted to thank you for all you've done. For taking us in, protecting us, sharing your home and food. She held out the coat. Jackson stared at it, clearly stunned. His weathered hands touched the fabric with wonder. This is, he started, then had to clear his throat. This is fine work. Try it on, Ruth urged, smiling. The coat fit him perfectly. The women had estimated his measurements well, and the multiple layers of fabric settled comfortably on his broad shoulders. He moved his arms, testing the give at the elbows, clearly impressed by the mobility. We used our wedding dresses, Maria explained. Seemed right, somehow, making something useful and good from what happened. Jackson's eyes grew damp as he understood the full meaning of their gift. These women had taken the very garments that marked their rejection and transformed them into a gesture of gratitude and acceptance. Each stitch represented their shared story of finding refuge and family in his cabin. No garment ever meant more to me, he said gruffly, running his hand over the careful stitching. I'll wear it proud. Willow ducked her head, but not before he caught her pleased smile. Her scarred hands, so steady with a needle, clasped together as if to hold in deeper emotions. The last of the trout made a meager but satisfying supper. The storm had blown itself out, leaving an odd pocket of peace. Hunger and worry temporarily eased as they gathered around the fire, sharing the warmth and unexpected companionship. Lydia started humming as she darned a sock. Soon Sarah joined in, then Ruth. The familiar hymn filled the cabin with gentle harmony. Even Maria, who knew only some of the words, added her clear voice to the chorus. Jackson sat in his new coat, watching them with rare contentment. The laughter started when Ruth told a story about her younger brother's attempts to catch a greased pig at a county fair. Soon, they were all sharing tales, the kind of simple memories that make up a life: Maria's first time riding bareback, Sarah's mishaps learning to make soap, Lydia's adventures keeping goats. Never thought I'd hear such carrying on in this old cabin again, Jackson said, allowing himself a smile. The coat settled warm around his shoulders, a constant reminder of the unexpected family he'd gained. Willow caught his eye across the fire. Something passed between them. Understanding, perhaps, or recognition of how life could surprise you with joy in the midst of hardship. She quickly looked away, but her hands remained steady as she worked on mending a torn apron. The peaceful moment broke when they heard it. The faint but unmistakable sound of hoofbeats echoing up from the valley below. The singing stopped. 5 women and 1 man held their breath, listening as the sound faded into the distance. Jackson stood, moving to the window. The storm had passed, leaving a crystalline night sky and deep snow. Somewhere out there, their enemies waited. The brief respite was ending. Yet, looking at the determined faces of the women around him, Jackson felt oddly strengthened. They had survived the storm together. They had found ways to support each other, to create beauty from destruction. His hand touched the coat they had made him, feeling the layers of fabric, each stitch a testament to resilience and hope. Whatever trials lay ahead, they would face them as a family. Morning brought crystal clarity to the mountain air. Sunlight glinted off fresh snow, nearly blinding in its brightness. Jackson McCord stood on his cabin's porch, squinting at the valley below. The storm's passing meant trouble wouldn't be far behind. He wasn't wrong. By mid-morning, the sound of multiple horses trudging through deep snow echoed up the slope. Jackson adjusted his new patchwork coat, its layers keeping him warm as he watched Sheriff Riggins and 4 deputies approach. "Ladies," he called through the door. "Best come out here. Looks like we've got company." The 5 women filed onto the porch, their breath clouding in the cold air. Willow's hand briefly touched Jackson's arm as she passed, a gesture of solidarity that didn't escape the sheriff's notice. Riggins dismounted with a grunt, his boots crunching in the snow. He pulled a leather document case from his saddlebag, his expression smug. "McCord," he announced, voice carrying across the crisp air. "Got some official business here." He withdrew several papers, making a show of smoothing them against his leg. "Court orders, signed by Judge Matthews himself. These women are legally bound to their intended husbands. You're harboring runaways from contractual obligations." Jackson's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "Reckon these ladies can speak for themselves about any obligations." "This ain't about speaking," Riggins snapped. "It's about the law. Those grooms paid good money for these marriage contracts. Judge says they've got rights." "Rights?" Sarah stepped forward, her voice trembling but clear. "What about our rights? I was humiliated at the altar when Thomas learned I couldn't bear children. He called me worthless in front of the whole town." Lydia joined her, chin high. "William took one look at me in my wedding dress and declared I was too fat to be his wife, said he'd been deceived about my figure." One by one, the women voiced their stories. Maria spoke of the slurs hurled at her Apache heritage. Willow touched her scarred face as she described her groom's cruel rejection. Ruth, though pale, stood with the others and told of being cast aside for a richer bride. The sheriff shifted uncomfortably in the snow, but pressed on. "Don't matter what was said. Papers is papers, law's the law." "The law?" Jackson's quiet voice carried dangerous undertones. "The law that lets men buy judges? That treats women like cattle to be traded?" He moved to stand shoulder to shoulder with the brides. "These ladies came to my door seeking sanctuary. They'll have it long as they want it." The women linked arms, forming a line across the porch. Willow's voice rang out clear and strong. "We are not property to be claimed. We refuse to return." "You're making a mistake, McCord," Riggins warned, fingers twitching near his gun belt. "There's fines for interfering with legal contracts. Jail time, too. Think careful about whose side you're taking." "Already have," Jackson replied evenly. "These women are under my protection. You want to start shooting over it? Might find that brings more trouble than you're looking for." The sheriff's face darkened, but he glanced at the determined faces before him. 6 people, ready to defend their makeshift family. Violence now would only complicate matters. "This ain't over," he growled, stuffing the papers back in their case. "I'll be back with enough men to enforce these warrants proper. You best rethink your position before then." Jackson watched silently as Riggins and his deputies mounted up and rode away. Only when they disappeared into the trees did he let out a long breath. The women's brave front crumbled as tension drained away. Maria sank onto a porch chair, shaking. Sarah wiped tears from her cheeks. Lydia wrapped her arms around herself, as if suddenly feeling the cold. "You did well," Jackson told them quietly. "Standing together like that. Speaking your truth." Willow turned to him, worry clear in her eyes. "But what happens when he comes back? He'll bring more men, more guns. We'll face that when it comes," Jackson said, ushering them inside where a fire still burned warm. "For now, we've shown them we won't be bullied easy." The afternoon passed in uneasy quiet. The women tried to keep busy, cooking, cleaning, mending, but fear hung heavy in the cabin. Jackson cleaned his rifles and checked his ammunition, grim-faced but steady. As evening approached, Ruth began coughing. At first, it seemed merely a reaction to the dry air. but the coughs grew deeper, more violent. When she pulled her handkerchief away from her mouth, bright red spots stained the white cloth. "Ruth?" Sarah rushed to her side as the young woman swayed on her feet. "Oh Lord, she's burning up!" Jackson reached Ruth just as her legs gave way. He caught her, lifting her slight form easily. Her skin blazed with fever against his hands. "Get the bed ready," he ordered, carrying her to his room. "Maria, fetch fresh water. Lydia, we need more blankets." They worked quickly, settling Ruth into the bed. Her breathing came in shallow gasps, face flushed with fever. Each cough brought more blood to her lips. "It's the pneumonia," Willow said softly, pressing a cool cloth to Ruth's forehead. She was already weak from working in that drafty seamstress shop. The cold journey here, the stress. The other women huddled nearby, faces drawn with concern. They had faced down the sheriff's threats together, but this enemy, illness, striking their youngest member, left them feeling helpless. "What can we do?" Sarah asked, clutching Ruth's hot hand. "She needs a doctor." "Nearest doctor's in town," Jackson said grimly, "and that's not safe right now." "We can't just let her die." Lydia's voice broke on a sob. Jackson looked at Ruth's pale face, then at the frightened women around him. The law's weight suddenly seemed less daunting than the prospect of losing one of their own to illness. "Keep her warm," he instructed. "Try to get her to drink water when she's able. I'll think of something." He stepped outside onto the porch, the cold air biting through even his new coat. Below, darkness crept up the valley like a rising tide. Somewhere down there waited men with warrants and weapons, ready to tear apart the family that had formed in his cabin. But now a different threat had slipped past his defenses, one that couldn't be fought with guns or brave words. Inside, he heard Ruth's racking cough, followed by quiet prayers from the other women. Jackson leaned against the porch rail, his heart heavy with worry. They had stood strong against the sheriff's threats, but this crisis struck at their very core. Ruth's illness threatened not just one life, but the bonds that held them together. He looked up at the cold stars emerging in the darkening sky. For the first time in years, he found himself forming words of prayer, asking for guidance, for strength, for a way to save not just Ruth's life, but the sanctuary they had built together. Behind him, the cabin door creaked open. Willow stepped out, her breath clouding in the frigid air. "Her fever's getting worse," she said softly. "Jackson, what are we going to do?" He turned to see fear and trust warring in her eyes. The weight of responsibility settled deeper on his shoulders. These women had placed their faith in him, and now one of them lay fighting for her life. The night closed in around them, full of uncertainty. Only the sound of Ruth's coughing broke the mountain silence, each painful echo a reminder that their greatest battle might not be against the law after all. The night stretched endless as Ruth's fever raged higher. Jackson moved through the cabin like a shadow, gathering what supplies he could find to fight the illness consuming their youngest member. His hands, usually so steady with a rifle, trembled as he measured willow bark into boiling water. The bitter smell of the medicinal tea filled the small cabin. Sarah and Lydia worked tirelessly, wringing out cool cloths to lay across Ruth's burning forehead. The young woman's breathing came in shallow gasps, each one rattling deep in her chest. "She's so hot," Sarah whispered, pressing her palm to Ruth's cheek. "I've never felt a fever like this." Willow knelt beside the bed, her scarred hands clasped around Ruth's limp fingers. In the flickering lamplight, she began to sing, her voice soft but clear. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me." The familiar hymn settled over the cabin like a blanket. Even Ruth seemed to quiet somewhat, her restless movements stilling as Willow's voice carried the melody. Jackson paused in his work, the words striking something deep within. Him, memories of his wife singing that very hymn as she worked, before illness took her too. "I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see." Outside, a wolf's lonely howl pierced the night. Another answered, closer, until a chorus of wild voices echoed through the darkness. Maria crossed herself, murmuring a prayer in Spanish. Lydia jumped at each new cry, her plump hands shaking as she dipped another cloth in cool water. "They won't come near the cabin," Jackson assured them, though the wolves' song added to the heavy dread filling his heart. He stirred the willow bark tea, willing it to steep faster, to work harder, to save Ruth's life. The other women had spread quilts near the fireplace, taking turns resting while two always stayed awake with Ruth. But sleep proved elusive. Every cough from the sick room brought them bolt upright. Every whimper had them rushing to check on their friend. Jackson found himself pacing, counting Ruth's labored breaths, measuring the hours until dawn. The helplessness ate at him worse than any physical hunger. He had promised these women sanctuary, protection. But what good were his guns and strength against an enemy he couldn't shoot? Near midnight, Ruth began muttering in delirium, calling for her long-dead parents. Her words broke into wet coughs that speckled her lips with blood. The sight drove Jackson to his knees beside the bed, something inside him finally cracking. "Please," he whispered, the first prayer to cross his lips in years. "Please, God, don't take her. She's just a girl. She's done nothing to deserve this." His voice grew hoarse with emotion. "If you're there, if you're listening, spare her, please." Willow's hand found his shoulder, warm and steady. She didn't speak, just kept singing hymns into the darkness, her faith a quiet anchor in the storm of fear. The night crawled forward. Sarah dozed in a chair, exhaustion finally claiming her. Lydia snored softly by the fire, while Maria kept guard, watch at the window, more afraid of human visitors than wolves. Only Willow remained awake with Jackson, the two of them trading places between Ruth's bedside and tending the fire. False dawn brought no improvement. Ruth's breathing grew more labored, her skin burning hotter despite their efforts to cool her. When she opened her eyes, they were glazed and unseeing, focused on something far beyond the cabin walls. Jackson stood at the window, watching the sky lighten to pearl gray. He knew what had to be done, though the thought twisted his gut. The agency doctor was their only hope now. A 3-hour ride through dangerous territory, leaving the women unprotected. "You have to go," Willow said softly behind him, reading his thoughts. "We'll manage here." He turned to face her, seeing the same fear he felt reflected in her eyes, but also determination. The sheriff could come back. Those grooms. "We'll bar the doors," she assured him. "Keep the rifles loaded, but Ruth needs help beyond what we can give." Jackson looked at the other women, now stirring with the dawn. They were no longer the frightened, bedraggled brides who had appeared at his door. Hardship had forged them into something stronger. They would defend their own. "I'll take the mule," he said finally. "She's surer-footed on the ice than my horse." He began gathering supplies, rope, blankets, his rifle. "Keep watch in all directions. Don't open the door for anyone but me." The women nodded, faces set with resolve. They helped him prepare, packing what food they could spare, checking his coat for tears that might let in the cold. Their hands lingered on the fabric they had sewn together, as if lending him their combined strength. Ruth coughed weakly from the bedroom, the sound spurring Jackson to move faster. Every minute counted now. He strapped on his gun belt, checked his ammunition, and pulled on heavy gloves. "I'll bring help," he promised, meeting each woman's eyes in turn. "Just keep her, fighting until I return." Willow walked him to the door, her face pale but composed. "We'll be praying," she said simply. Outside, the dawn air bit sharp as a knife. Jackson led his mule from the stable, her breath steaming in the cold. The trail down to the agency looked treacherous, glazed with ice and half hidden in shadow. Wolves had left tracks in the fresh snow, and somewhere out there, men with badges and warrants waited too. He swung into the saddle, adjusting his rifle across his lap. Behind him, the cabin windows glowed warm with lamplight. Through the glass, he could see the women gathering for morning prayers, their lips moving in silent supplication. Jackson touched the brim of his hat, a farewell and a promise. Then he turned the mule's head downhill and started forward, each step carrying him further from his charges and closer to whatever dangers waited below. The sun crept above the mountains, painting the snow gold, as man and beast picked their careful way down the icy trail. "Keep them safe," he whispered to the dawn sky. "Keep them all safe until I return." The cabin grew smaller behind him, until it was just a dark spot against the white slope. Still, he could hear Willow's hymn in his mind, carrying him forward with hope and purpose. Ruth's life, and perhaps all their futures, depended on this desperate ride for help. Jackson hunched low over his mule's neck as bitter wind cut across his face. The new coat the brides had made him blocked most of the cold, but nothing could shield against the icy air that seemed determined to freeze his very breath. Below him stretched the dangerous trail, a ribbon of white winding down through dark pines. He kept the mule to a careful walk. One wrong step on hidden ice could mean a broken leg, or worse. The sure-footed animal picked her way forward, testing each placement before shifting her weight. Jackson had seen too many good horses go down on mountain trails to risk rushing now, no matter how Ruth's fevered face haunted him. The morning sun cast long shadows across the snow, making it harder to spot treacherous patches. His mule's hooves crunched through the crust, each step echoing in the winter silence. Only the occasional cry of a jay broke the stillness. Movement ahead made Jackson's hand drift to his rifle. A figure emerged from the trees, a Ute hunter, bow across his back and 3 rabbits at his belt. The man raised his hand in peaceful greeting. "Bad riding," the hunter said in careful English, gesturing at the icy trail. "Many soldiers with white man's law, chief. Coming this way soon." He pointed back toward town. Jackson's jaw tightened. "The sheriff's bringing troops?" The hunter nodded. 4 blue coats, many guns. He studied Jackson's face. "You have trouble with law, chief?" "Protecting some folks who need it," Jackson said simply. Understanding flickered in the hunter's dark eyes. His people knew well how the law could be twisted against the innocent. "Take care, mountain brother." Law chief's heart is black as winter sky. They parted with respectful nods, the hunter melting back into the forest while Jackson pressed onward, his worry growing heavier. Soldiers meant the sheriff had convinced the fort commander to intervene. That changed everything. The sun wheeled overhead as Jackson guided his mule down switchbacks and across icy streams. By late afternoon, his mount's flanks were lathered despite the cold, and his own muscles ached from tension. Finally, the Indian agency came into view, a cluster of log buildings in the valley below. Dusk was falling as Jackson dismounted at the hitching post. His legs nearly buckled, stiff from hours in the saddle. Light glowed in the agency office windows, and smoke curled from the chimney. He stamped his feet to restore circulation before climbing the steps. The clerk looked up with obvious annoyance when Jackson entered, letting in a blast of cold air. "We're about to close for the day. Need doctor. Halpern," Jackson said. "Got a girl dying of fever up my way." The clerk's expression didn't change. "Doctor's probably home by now. Come back tomorrow." Jackson planted both hands on the desk, leaning forward. "Either fetch him now, or I'll search every building here myself." Something in his voice must have convinced the clerk. The man rose with a put-upon sigh and shuffled out. Jackson waited, watching darkness gather outside the windows. Dr. Halpern arrived 15 minutes later, medical bag in hand. He was a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles and gray threading his beard. "What are the symptoms?" he asked without preamble. Jackson described Ruth's condition, the bloody cough, the raging fever, the delirium. The doctor nodded gravely. "Sounds like pneumonia. We should leave at first light tomorrow." "We need to go now," Jackson insisted. Dr. Halpern shook his head. "That trail's dangerous enough in daylight. At night, it's suicide. Neither of us will help your patient by breaking our necks in the dark." Deep down, Jackson knew he was right, but the thought of waiting through another night twisted in his gut like a knife. "The sheriff's bringing soldiers," he said quietly. The doctor's eyebrows rose. "Elias Riggins? What's he got to do with this?" Jackson gave him the bare facts. 5 women seeking refuge, unjust warrants, threats of force. Understanding dawned in the doctor's tired eyes. "I've treated the aftermath of Riggins' idea of justice before," he said. "But we still can't risk the night trail. Get some rest in the barn. There's fresh hay in the loft. We'll leave at first light." Jackson had no choice but to agree. He tended to his mule, then climbed into the hayloft. The barn was warmer than outside, but sleep proved elusive. He kept seeing Ruth's flushed face, hearing Willow's hymns, feeling the weight of his promise to protect them all. Dawn came with painful slowness. Jackson was already saddling his mule when Dr. Halpern arrived, medical bag secured to his horse's saddle. They set out as the sun crested the mountains, frost crackling under their mount's hooves. Meanwhile, back at the cabin, Willow moved like a woman possessed. She hadn't slept more than minutes at a time since Jackson left, dividing her attention between Ruth's bedside and preparing for trouble. "Maria," "Check those knots again," she called, watching the Mexican woman secure a tripwire across the path to the door. "Lydia, we need more snow melted for drinking water. Sarah, it's your turn to rest." The women moved with quiet purpose, their fear channeled into action. They had strung rope between trees to string up warnings, tin cans that would rattle if anyone approached. Rifles were loaded and positioned near windows. The heavy bar across the door was reinforced. But Willow's main battle was at Ruth's bedside. The girl's breathing had grown more labored through the night, each breath a wet, rattling sound that tore at Willow's heart. She wrung out another cool cloth, wiping Ruth's burning face. "Don't you give up," she whispered fiercely. "The doctor's coming. Jackson will bring help. You just keep fighting." She sang hymns until her voice grew hoarse, then hummed when she could no longer form words. The other women joined in when they could, their voices weaving together in harmony born of shared fear and hope. "The Lord is my shepherd," Willow prayed, holding Ruth's hot hand between her own. "I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures." Outside, the winter sun climbed higher. Every distant sound made them freeze. Was it horses approaching? The sheriff and his soldiers? But only the wind answered, howling around the cabin's corners like a hungry wolf. Ruth's fever showed no signs of breaking. If anything, she seemed to sink deeper into delirium, her few conscious moments filled with confusion. They spooned water and willow bark tea between her cracked lips, but much of it spilled down her chin. "Come on, Ruth," Willow pleaded. "Stay with us. We need you. You're part of our family now." Family. The word felt right, even though they'd known each other only days. Hardship and fear had forged bonds stronger than blood between them all. Willow moved to the window, scanning the snowy slope for any sign of Jackson and the doctor. The morning was wearing on, the shadows shortening toward noon. How long would it take them to return? And who else might reach the cabin first? She touched the rough wooden cross hanging at her throat, a gift from her mother, the only thing that survived the fire that scarred her face. "Lord," she whispered, "protect them on the trail. Guide them home to us. And please, please spare Ruth's life." Behind her, the fire crackled in the hearth, its warmth fighting against the creeping cold of fear. Willow straightened her shoulders and returned to Ruth's bedside. They would endure. They would survive. Together. "Beyond Death's Valley, though I go," she sang softly, taking up Ruth's hand once more. "Yet will I fear no ill." The words of the psalm floated out into the winter day, a declaration of faith against whatever darkness gathered on the horizon. Willow kept singing, kept praying, kept hoping. For Ruth's life, for Jackson's safe return, for all their futures. Outside, snow began to fall again, adding another layer of white to the transformed world. The winter sun hung low on the horizon when Jackson and Dr. Halpern finally reached the cabin. Icicles had formed in their horses' manes, and frost coated their coat collars. Jackson's bones ached from the cold, but relief flooded through him at the sight of smoke rising steadily from the chimney. Maria opened the door at their approach, rifle ready until she recognized them. "Thank the Lord," she whispered, quickly helping them inside. The cabin's warmth hit Jackson like a physical force. His gaze went straight to Ruth's bed, where the young woman lay still and pale against the quilts. Willow sat beside her, pressing a damp cloth to her forehead. The other brides huddled nearby, their faces drawn with exhaustion. Dr. Halpern wasted no time. He shrugged off his snow-crusted coat and moved to Ruth's bedside, setting down his black leather medical bag. "How long has she been like this?" he asked, pressing his fingers to her wrist. "The fever started 2 nights ago," Willow answered, her voice hoarse from singing. "The cough began earlier that day." The doctor nodded, pulling out his stethoscope. He listened to Ruth's chest, his expression grave. "Her lungs are congested, pneumonia, as I suspected." He reached into his bag and brought out several small brown bottles. "We'll need to act quickly." Jackson sank into a chair by the fire, his muscles trembling with fatigue. Sarah pressed a cup of hot coffee into his hands. "You made good time," she said softly. "Not fast enough," he muttered, watching the doctor work. Dr. Halpern mixed tinctures in a cup, his movements precise. "This contains golden seal and echinacea for the infection, plus willow bark for the fever. She'll need a dose every 4 hours." He turned to the women. Keep her warm, but not too hot. Prop her up to help her breathing. And she needs broth, as much as you can get her to swallow. Lydia was already heading to the cook stove. I'll heat some now. The doctor spent the next hour showing them how to administer the medicine and checking Ruth's vital signs. The girl stirred only slightly when they spooned the bitter tincture between her lips, but she swallowed reflexively. That's good, Dr. Halpern said. She's still fighting. Night fell outside as they tended to Ruth. The women took turns sitting with her, wiping her face, singing softly. Jackson paced between the fire and the window, watching both Ruth and the darkness beyond the cabin. Near midnight, Ruth's breathing changed. The terrible rattling eased slightly, and her face looked less flushed. Dr. Halpern checked her, fever again, and smiled faintly. It's breaking, he announced. A collective sigh of relief swept through the cabin. Sarah began to cry quietly, while Maria crossed herself in gratitude. Willow reached for Ruth's hand, squeezing it gently. Jackson felt something crack inside his chest, a wall of ice he'd built around his heart years ago. Without thinking, he sank to his knees beside the bed. "Thank you, Lord," he whispered, his voice rough. "Thank you." The words felt strange on his tongue after so long, but right. He hadn't prayed aloud since losing his wife, hadn't dared to hope for mercy, but here it was, flowing like spring water through his frozen soul. Dr. Halpern stayed through the night, dozing in Jackson's chair while the others took turns watching Ruth. By dawn, color had begun returning to her cheeks. Her breathing, while still labored, was stronger. "Keep giving her the medicine," the doctor instructed as he prepared to leave. "Plenty of broth and rest. I'll try to return in a few days to check on her progress." He paused, glancing at Jackson. "And watch for the sheriff. Word in town is he's not giving up." Jackson nodded grimly. "We'll be ready." After the doctor rode away, the cabin settled into a gentler rhythm. Ruth slept peacefully for the first time in days. The other women moved quietly, tending the fire, preparing food, changing cool cloths on Ruth's forehead. As evening approached, Willow began to sing again. Her voice, though tired, carried clearly in the cabin's warmth. Jackson recognized the hymn immediately. It was the same one his wife Mary had loved, the one she'd sung even as consumption took her strength. "Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound." The familiar words wrapped around Jackson's heart like a warm blanket. He closed his eyes, remembering Mary's voice, her gentle spirit, her unwavering faith, even at the end. For years, he'd pushed those memories away, too painful to bear. But now, hearing Willow sing, the pain transformed into something else, something that felt like healing. The other women joined in softly, their voices weaving together in simple harmony. Even Ruth stirred slightly, her lips moving as if trying to sing too. "Was blind, but now I see." Jackson opened his eyes to find tears on his cheeks. He didn't try to hide them. Looking around the cabin, he saw what he'd been missing all these years. Not just people, but family. These 5 women, brought to him by providence and desperation, had filled his home with more than just their presence. They'd brought back grace. Willow's voice carried the final verse alone, clear and pure as mountain spring water. In the firelight, her scars seemed to fade, revealing the beauty of her spirit shining through. Jackson found himself watching her, seeing not the marks of past tragedy, but the strength that had brought her through it. The hymn ended, its last notes floating in the peaceful quiet. Ruth's breathing was steady and deep. The fire crackled softly, and outside, snow began falling again in large, gentle flakes. Then they heard it, the distant thunder of hoofbeats coming up the valley. Jackson moved to the window, his hand going to his revolver. But for the first time in days, fear didn't grip him. Looking at the women gathered around Ruth's bed, at Willow's quiet strength, at the evidence of God's mercy in their midst, he felt something stronger than fear. They would face whatever came together, with faith renewed and hope burning brighter than any fire. Dawn crept over the mountain peaks, painting the snow-covered clearing in shades of rose and gold. Inside Jackson's cabin, the inhabitants moved with quiet purpose, knowing confrontation was coming. They had spent the night preparing, gathering documents and steeling their hearts for what lay ahead. The sound of multiple horses approaching made them all pause. Jackson peered through the frost-edged window, counting the riders through the morning mist. "Sheriff's got company," he said grimly. 4 grooms, 2 soldiers in blue coats. Willow stood beside him, her scarred face set with determination. "Then it's time." The riders pulled up in the clearing, their horses' breath steaming in the cold air. Sheriff Riggins sat tall in his saddle, wearing his tin star like armor. Behind him, the 4 grooms shifted uneasily, their faces pinched with spite and wounded pride. The soldiers looked bored but official, their uniforms crisp despite the morning chill. "McCord!" the sheriff bellowed. "Send those women out now. We aim to settle this today." Jackson checked his rifle, making sure it was loaded but keeping his movements unhurried. "Stay close," he told the brides. "Remember what we discussed." Inside the cabin, Ruth struggled to sit up in her bed, still weak from her illness but alert. "I'm coming too," she insisted. "Careful now," Lydia cautioned, helping her stand. The heavy cabin door creaked open. Jackson stepped out first, rifle held low but ready. The morning sun caught the patchwork coat he wore, made from the bride's wedding dresses, each piece telling its own story of rejection turned to strength. Behind him came the women, filing out with quiet dignity. They formed a line on the cabin's porch, heads held high despite their simple clothes and work-worn hands. Willow stood closest to Jackson, while Maria and Sarah flanked Ruth, supporting her between them. Sheriff Riggins's lip curled. "One man against the law? You're outnumbered, McCord. We've got papers, soldiers, and the power of proper authority." "Papers bought with bribes, you mean?" Jackson replied evenly. "And soldiers who might not take kindly to being used for personal vendettas." The 2 military men exchanged uncertain glances. "These women are promised in marriage," one of the grooms called out, a thin man with a merchant's soft hands. "The law supports a man's right to his intended." "The law supports truth," Willow answered, her voice carrying clear and strong across the snow. "And the truth is, you all rejected us first." Ruth stepped forward then, shaking off her supporters. Though pale, she stood straight. "You threw us away like worthless things," she said, her young voice trembling but firm. "Called us damaged goods, mocked us in the street. We will not be dragged back to such cruelty." The sheriff's face darkened. "Pretty words won't change facts. You women have no standing, no property, no rights to—" "That's where you're wrong," Lydia cut in. She pulled a folded document from her apron pocket, holding it high. "This here's the deed to my father's ranch. 500 acres of good grazing land, left to me legal and proper before he died. I own that land free and clear." A murmur ran through the mounted men. The sheriff's mouth tightened. Sarah stepped forward next, her banker's daughter's education evident in her precise speech. "And I hold 20 shares of railroad stock, inherited from my grandmother. That's more than you own, Mr. Preston." She addressed one of the grooms directly. "I checked the books myself before I left town." The named man flushed dark red, his hand dropping to his gun belt before the sheriff waved him still. But it was Maria who delivered the strongest blow. She moved to the front of the group, her mixed heritage evident in her proud bearing. "I am my father's daughter and my mother's child," she declared. "The Treaty of 1868 guarantees protection of my rights and property. By threatening me, you risk federal intervention." She smiled thinly at the soldiers. "I'm sure these gentlemen know the penalties for violating Indian treaties." The soldiers straightened in their saddles, suddenly looking far more attentive. One leaned over to whisper something to the sheriff, whose face grew increasingly frustrated. "This is nonsense," he blustered. "You can't expect—" "We expect justice," Jackson interrupted. "These women came to me for sanctuary, and they have proven they're worth 100 times over. They're not property to be claimed. They're free souls under God's heaven, same as any man." The morning light strengthened, catching the frost in the air and making it sparkle like diamonds. The tableau held frozen for a long moment. The armed men on their horses, the steadfast group on the porch, truth hanging in the balance between them. Finally, one of the soldiers cleared his throat. "Sheriff, if there's legal property involved, and treaty rights, well, this ain't the kind of thing we can just ride over. Need proper courts and such." The other soldier nodded. "And I ain't keen on tangling with Indian affairs. That's more trouble than it's worth." Sheriff Riggins's authority visibly deflated. He glared at the women, at Jackson, at the damning documents they held. His hand clenched on his reins until his knuckles showed white. The grooms began shifting uneasily, their earlier bravado crumbling. Without the sheriff's backing, without the soldiers' support, they were just 5 men who had shown their true characters through cruelty. "This isn't over," Riggins growled, but the threat in his voice rang hollow. "Yes," Willow said quietly. "It is." The sheriff yanked his horse's head around, spurs jangling. "Mount up," he barked at his companions. "We're riding back to town." The group watched as the men retreated, their horses' hooves breaking through the morning's thin crust of ice. The sound grew fainter and fainter until only the mountain silence remained. Ruth sagged slightly, her strength fading. The other women quickly helped her back inside to her bed, but her eyes shone with triumph despite her weakness. Jackson remained on the porch a moment longer, watching until the last rider disappeared into the trees. When he turned back to the cabin, he found Willow waiting in the doorway. "You stood with us," she said softly. "Truth needed standing with," he replied. Inside, the other women were already moving about their morning tasks, stoking the fire, starting breakfast, tending to Ruth. But there was a new lightness to their movements, a sense of victory, hard won but complete. The morning sun streamed through the windows, catching the patches of wedding dress silk in Jackson's coat, making them glow like stained glass. Outside, the mountains stood eternal witness to how a family could be built from broken pieces, how rejection could be transformed into strength, and how truth, in the end, would always stand. The thunder of retreating hoofbeats faded into mountain silence. Jackson watched until the last rider disappeared among the pines, then turned to the women still standing brave on his porch. Their faces showed a mix of disbelief and dawning joy. "Let's get inside before Ruth catches her death," he said gently, ushering them through the door. The cabin's warmth embraced them like a mother's arms. Sarah and Maria helped Ruth back to her bed by the fire, while Lydia rushed to put on coffee. The moment Ruth was settled, the emotions they had all held in check during the confrontation came flooding out. Tears streamed down faces, but these were different from the bitter drops shed on that first desperate night. These were tears of relief, of victory, of freedom finally claimed. "I cannot believe we did that," Sarah whispered, dabbing her eyes with her apron. "Standing up to them like that. I never thought I had such courage in me." "You showed them what true strength looks like," Jackson said, hanging his rifle back on its pegs. "All of you did. I have never been prouder of anyone in all my days." Willow moved to the stove, helping Lydia with the coffee. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the cups. "We could not have done it without you, Mr. McCord," she said softly, turning to meet his eyes. "You stood beside us when no one else would, when everyone else saw only broken things to be claimed or discarded." Jackson's weathered face softened. "I reckon I just recognized something in you all that reminded me of my Caroline. She knew what it meant to be judged unfairly, to have folks try to steal your dignity, but she never let them break her spirit." He touched the patchwork coat he wore, fingers tracing the different pieces of wedding dress silk. "Like this here coat shows, sometimes what others throw away turns out to be the strongest thing of all." Maria had been quiet, but now she spoke up from where she sat beside Ruth's bed. "They thought we were helpless women they could bully. They never expected us to have resources, or rights, or the courage to use them." "The look on their faces when you mentioned that treaty," Lydia chuckled, bringing the steaming coffee cups around. "I thought the sheriff might swallow his own tongue." Ruth pushed herself up against her pillows, color high in her cheeks. "And Sarah with her railroad shares, and Lydia's ranch deed. We may have been rejected brides, but we were never powerless. We just needed to remember that." The cabin filled with laughter then, bright, healing laughter that chased away the last shadows of fear. Jackson watched them. These 5 women who had arrived at his door like broken birds and now stood tall as mountains. Something inside his own heart, long frozen, began to thaw. As the afternoon light softened toward dusk, Lydia and Maria worked together at the stove, preparing a feast from their simple stores: beans simmered with salt, pork, golden cornbread, and the last precious jar of preserved peaches. The smell of celebration filled the cabin. They gathered around the table, heads bowed as Jackson offered grace. "Lord, we thank you for this food, for safety, for justice done. Most of all, we thank you for bringing this unlikely family together under one roof. Amen. Amen." The women echoed, and there was joy in the word. They passed the dishes, savoring each bite of their victory meal. Talk flowed easily, plans and hopes mixing with memories of the morning's confrontation. "But what happens now?" Sarah asked finally, voicing the question in all their minds. "Where do we go from here?" "Where?" Jackson set down his coffee cup. "Winter's coming on hard," he said seriously. "Even with the sheriff and those grooms backing down, survival up here won't be easy. It takes work, hard work, to make it through to spring." "Then we'll work," Willow said firmly. "We've already learned so much. Hauling wood, fetching water, setting snares. We can learn more." The other women nodded. Lydia spoke up. "I know ranching, from my father. I can help with any livestock. I can teach the children from nearby homesteads," Willow added. "Bring in some income that way." "I know medicinal plants," Maria offered. "And I can tan hides, make soap. I can keep accounts, handle correspondence," Sarah said. "And I make a fine preserves come harvest time," Ruth smiled from her sickbed. "Once I'm strong again, I can sew, cook, tend a garden. We all have something to offer." Jackson looked around at their eager faces, lit by firelight and purpose. "Then I reckon we have ourselves a household," he said. "If you're all willing to stay on, work together, make this place a real home." "We are willing," they answered, almost in unison. The evening deepened into night. They cleared the table, banked the fire, tended to Ruth. But no one seemed eager for sleep. They sat together in the warm lamplight, sharing stories and songs. Willow's clear voice led them in hymns of thanksgiving. Even Jackson joined in, remembering words he thought long forgotten. For the first time since that desperate midnight knock, laughter rang free and unguarded in the cabin. It spilled from the windows into the starlit night, echoing off the mountainsides long after the lamps were blown out. In their separate beds, each member of this newfound family fell asleep to the comfortable sounds of breathing, the crackle of the fire, and the knowledge that they were no longer alone. Jackson lay, awake longest, listening to the peaceful quiet. The cabin felt different now, no longer a shelter for his solitude, but a sanctuary for healing hearts. Through the window, he could see the stars wheeling over the mountains, constant as God's love. He touched the patchwork coat hanging nearby, feeling the different textures of silk and muslin under his fingers. Like these discarded wedding dresses transformed into something new and strong, they were all being remade together into something beautiful and lasting. Sleep found him at last, deep and dreamless, while outside the winter wind sang softly through the pines, carrying their story to the listening stars. The mountain winter slowly released its grip as February melted into March. Patches of bare ground emerged beneath melting snow, dark and rich with promise. Inside Jackson McCord's cabin, life had found a steady rhythm that felt as natural as the changing seasons. Ruth's recovery brought joy to them all. Her strength returned like the spring itself, gradual but certain. Soon she could sit up for hours, then walk short distances, and finally help with light chores around the cabin. The circles beneath her eyes faded, replaced by a healthy glow that made her look younger than her 19 years. "The Lord wasn't finished with me yet," she would say, smiling as she folded fresh laundry or stirred the cooking pot. Lydia spent long hours at the rough-hewn table, poring over documents related to her father's ranch. Her inheritance rights were clear, but claiming them would require careful planning. She made lists of supplies they would need, calculating costs for seed and livestock. "We'll need to repair the fences first thing," she would explain to anyone who would listen, her eyes bright with purpose. "Then we can think about bringing in cattle once the grass comes up strong." Sarah proved to be a patient teacher, gathering the others around the fire each evening to practice their letters. Maria already knew, some reading from her father, and Willow had her teaching background, but Ruth and Lydia started from scratch. Under Sarah's guidance, they traced letters in spilled flour on the table, sounded out simple words, and gradually progressed to reading from Sarah's small collection of books. "Knowledge is power," Sarah would remind them, "and no one can take it from you once you have it." Maria rode out frequently to visit her mother's people, carrying messages and small gifts. Her natural diplomacy helped ease the tensions that often sparked between settlers and the Apache. She would return with medicines, news, and sometimes fresh game, building trust with each visit. My mother's people say the land has room for all who respect it, she told them one evening, sharing strips of dried venison. We can live as neighbors if we choose to. Through it all, Willow and Jackson found themselves drawn together like two stars sharing an orbit. It started simply enough. She would join him on his morning checks of the property, learning the signs of weather and wildlife. He would linger when she sang hymns in the evening, his deep voice eventually joining her clear one. They mended fences together, their hands working in comfortable silence. She learned to read the land as he did, noting which slopes would green first, where the deer would come to browse. He found himself watching her when she wasn't looking, admiring the quiet grace with which she moved through her days. One soft evening in early spring, they stood together, watching geese return from their winter grounds, their calls echoing across the valley. The air held that particular sweetness that comes with thaw, and new grass pushed through the remaining snow at their feet. Willow touched her scarred cheek unconsciously, a gesture Jackson had come to recognize as a sign she was deep in thought. "I never thought I would find this," she said quietly. "Find what?" Jackson asked, though something in his heart already knew. "Peace. Purpose." She paused, gathering courage. "For so long after the fire, I believed no man would ever see past this." Her fingers traced the scar tissue. "I accepted that I would always be alone." Jackson turned to face her fully, his weathered face gentle in the fading light. "You know what I see when I look at you?" She shook her head, not trusting her voice. "I see the strength that held us all together these past months, the courage that faced down the sheriff, the faith that helped bring Ruth back to health." He took her hand, his calloused fingers warm against hers. "Your scar is just a mark of survival, like the lightning scars on an old tree. It's your heart that saved us all." Willow's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. Jackson drew her closer, and she came willingly into his embrace. They stood together as the last geese passed overhead, their wings dark against the purple sky. The cabin that had once echoed with Jackson's solitude now buzzed with life and purpose. Mornings brought the smell of coffee and cornbread, the murmur of prayers, the scratch of Sarah's pencil as she kept their accounts. Days filled with shared work, hauling water, tending the first spring vegetables in the kitchen garden, preserving the last of winter's stores. Evenings brought reading lessons, hymn singing, and plans for the future. Ruth's laugh rang clear again, while Maria's quiet wisdom helped bridge old divisions. Lydia's practical knowledge and Sarah's careful planning gave shape to their dreams. And through it all, Willow's gentle presence drew Jackson further from his shell, teaching him that love could bloom again like spring flowers through melting snow. The cabin had become more than shelter. It was now truly a home, built not of logs alone but of shared hopes, mutual care, and the kind of love that grows stronger through trial. As winter's grip loosened day by day, their bonds only grew stronger, promising a future as bright as the lengthening days. Late spring painted the mountain slopes in vibrant greens and splashes of wildflower color. Around Jackson McCord's cabin, new life bustled everywhere. A dozen chickens scratched in the yard, pecking at scattered corn and fresh grass shoots, their gentle clucking mixed with the steady thump of Jackson's hammer as he worked on the barn roof, replacing winter-damaged shingles. In the newly tilled garden, neat rows of vegetables pushed through dark soil. Potato plants spread their leaves beside climbing bean poles, while tender lettuce and cabbage promised future harvests. The women had worked together to fence it against rabbits, using skills Jackson taught them months ago. Willow and Sarah hung fresh-washed linens on lines, strung between sturdy posts. The white sheets billowed like sails in the mountain breeze. Maria and Ruth folded dried clothes into baskets, while Lydia pinned up more garments, all of them chatting easily as they worked. "Those chickens are laying better than I hoped," Lydia called out, her practical nature showing through. "We'll have eggs enough to trade come market day." Maria nodded, smoothing a folded shirt. "My mother's people might trade for some. They value fresh eggs." The scene struck Jackson as he paused in his work, hammer resting against his knee. Last winter's desperate midnight knock seemed like a distant dream now. These women, who had arrived as frightened castaways in torn wedding dresses, now moved with confidence and purpose. Their laughter rang clear in the spring air. When Sunday arrived, they gathered as usual in the cabin's main room. Sunlight streamed through clean windows, catching dust motes that danced above the rough-hewn floor. Sarah opened their shared Bible, its pages worn smooth by daily reading. They sang hymns together, their voices joining in harmony that filled every corner of the cabin. After the last notes faded, Jackson cleared his throat. He stood, wearing the patchwork coat they had made him, and faced the group. His weathered hands clasped and unclasped as he gathered his thoughts. "I have something to say," he began, his voice steady but gentle. "These months together have changed us all. Changed me most of all, I reckon." He turned to Willow, who sat quietly by the fire. "With everyone here as witness, I want to declare my intention to court you proper, Willow Harper. Not as a man claiming ownership, but as one seeking partnership in life and faith." Willow's eyes glistened as she met his gaze. The scar on her face seemed to fade in the joy of her smile. "I would be honored, Jackson McCord," she replied softly. The other women burst into delighted cheers. Ruth clapped her hands while Sarah wiped happy tears. Lydia beamed like a proud mother, and Maria's usual reserve melted into a bright smile. Their celebration opened a flood of shared dreams. Each woman spoke of her plans, hopes no longer hidden by fear or shame. Lydia straightened her shoulders as she spoke. "Come, Summer. I mean to reclaim my father's ranch. It's rightfully mine, and I aim to run it proper." Her confidence showed how far she had come from the woman mocked for her size. Sarah smoothed her skirt, teacher's dignity in her bearing. "I want to start a small school. These mountains need learning as much as any place. Children shouldn't grow up without books and numbers." Maria's dark eyes held both determination and wisdom. "I will continue building understanding between my mother's people and the settlers. There's room enough in these mountains for all, if we choose peace." Ruth, healthy color in her cheeks now, spoke last. "My place is here, helping tend this homestead. I've found my family at last." Jackson stood on the cabin's porch as afternoon sun bathed the yard in golden light. He watched the women move through their tasks, their easy companionship evident in every gesture and shared smile. Willow caught his eye and smiled, the expression warming him deeper than any fire could. "They knocked on my door as castaways," he whispered, wonder in his voice. "Now they are my family, and they changed my life forever." The words carried on the spring breeze, a testimony to God's mysterious ways. This cabin, once a shelter for his solitude, had become something far greater. It was a home where rejection had been transformed into belonging, where wounds had healed into strength, where faith had grown from the seeds of mercy. The mountain air carried the scent of blooming wildflowers and fresh-turned earth. Chickens scratched in the yard, while laundry danced on the lines. Inside, the walls that had once echoed with emptiness now held the warmth of family prayers and shared meals. Around the cabin, the awakened land mirrored their own rebirth winter's trials, yielding to spring's promise, new life rising from what seemed lost. This was no longer a story of 5 cast-off brides and a lonely mountain man. It was the story of a family, stitched together by mercy, bound by choice and faith, stronger than any blood tie could forge. Together, they had built something beautiful from the broken pieces of their lives. Together, they would face whatever seasons lay ahead. Thanks for tuning in. These stories remind us that life is more than headlines, it's about heartlines. Subscribe if you want more moments that make you pause, feel, and reflect.